Hey everyone, it's Shaylin, and I'm here today with another video. Some of you might remember when about a year ago I made a video on voice, and then I privated the video. And I have been confusing people with that decision to private my video on voice ever since. I decided to private that video because there were just a few details that I didn't really agree with anymore, and if I have learned one thing, it's that people don't read pinned comments. And there were also just a lot more things I wanted to talk about. Voice is like my favorite story element, and I felt like there were a lot of things I didn't touch on in the video that I wanted to touch on. Let's talk about crafting a strong character voice. Now, voice isn't just your writing style, but rather the combination of your writing style and the character's personality. So you kind of have your natural writing style, but every character you write is going to be different. It's going to influence that voice in a different way. Now, this applies to all point of views. It's not just first person, but third person as well, second person, even third person omniscient. If you're creating an omniscient point of view where the narrator itself has a persona, or if your omniscient narrator gets a little voicier as it sneaks into people's heads. In my original video, I said that a reader would not be distracted if the level of articulation and intelligence and poetry was higher than would be likely for the character. And I want to revise that and say it depends. Quite likely that if you're writing a character who isn't a writer, and you yourself are a writer, that you are going to have a more articulate way with words, probably a more artful way with words, than your character. And in many instances, this is totally fine, and the reader will totally suspend their disbelief. There are so many instances where the reader isn't going to notice the fact that the character's voice might be much more artful than the character would be capable of. When we think, it's not just words, we think with multiple senses, and as a result, translating that to just words, I think, can be allowed some embellishment in the words that are used in order to create the effect of thought, because thought is more complex than just written words. So now you have to basically have thought that turns into written word that turns back into thought. And in order to do that, the written word needs to be a bit more complex than just the words that you would use to think in your actual thought process, because you're not just thinking in words. However, there will be cases where it is distracting, and it really depends on the character. A really great example of this is Room by Emma Donoghue. I actually haven't read the whole book, but I've read parts of the book. That book is told from the point of view of a 5-year-old, and it would be really disingenuous to just write that kind of in your normal style. She really got into the voice of a 5-year-old telling the story in first person present tense from a 5-year-old's point of view. Is the point of view probably still a little more articulate than an actual 5-year-old? Yeah, but she really had to modify her voice to fit the intelligence and maturity level of her narrator. So it's going to depend. There are cases where you can get away with the artfulness of your voice not distracting from the realism of who this character is, and there are cases where it will distract. That's kind of something you have to decide for yourself based on the character and the situation. The next tip I want to mention is actually a don't. It's a question that I see raised quite a lot, especially in the comments section on my prose series where I talk about line editing your prose, and people ask me questions like, is it okay to include things like weasel words, which are, redundant words, if it enhances the voice? And my answer would be, in most cases, no. Voice is found in your strong words, not your weak words. So if you're relying on what is really bad writing, adding redundant words, having weak sentence structure in order to create voice, you're creating voice the wrong way. There are so many other ways of creating voice and manipulating voice in order to suit the character. Voiciness is in the strong words you choose, not the weak words you choose. So instead of adding weak words, which makes your writing weaker in order to create voice, think about choosing better strong words. There might be a case or two where you want to use a weak word for voiciness, but it shouldn't be the general way you create voice. Like if you decide, I'm going to create voice by using a ton of filters, weasel words, and whatever, other things that are kind of just weakening the prose, that's kind of the weakest way to create voice, because it's going to make the reading experience less enjoyable. It's going to make the prose mushy and difficult to read, and it's not going to make a voice that's lively. It's going to make a voice that's quite mushy, and you want your voice to liven the story with the character's personality, not drag it down. So what are some ways to enhance voice in a stronger way? So the first thing is what I talked about in the original video, and it is patterning. As with almost any element of writing, plot, character, setting, pretty much everything, voice comes down to basically two choices: what you say and how you say it. Patterning is essentially that. It is a pattern that you inject into your narrative. It doesn't have to be omnipresent, but it's kind of just that thing that is, it's a current. You can think of it as an undercurrent that appears throughout your story. There are two kinds of patterns that you might see. There are content patterns and linguistic patterns. So first, I'm going to talk about content patterns. So content patterns are the what you say. This is going to include everything from the general content you're talking about, but also how you talk about events. It extends beyond just how you use poetic devices, but I think that's the clearest way to articulate it. I would look at my character and I would think about what's important to them, and I would use that to inform my similes and other poetic devices. If my character was a musician, I might use a lot of music-related terminology and analogy. Or if my character was a mathematician, I might refer to math a lot. Once I had a character with a violence pattern, she was a lot of the analogies were just really violent and shocking because that's who she was as a character. Now, obviously, if you were in a novel and you were writing a book about a sailor, it's going to be kind of ridiculous if every single simile is related to nautical themed things. This isn't something you have to go overboard with, it's just a technique you can implement at times. But there are also ways that you can stay close to your pattern without being exactly in it. Let's say I had a bird pattern and there were a lot of birds, and it got to a point where there were way too many, so I really had to switch up some of my poetic devices, but I still wanted to stay in theme. I would kind of look at birds and I would map outwards. I kind of think of it as taking a step horizontally. So you're not like way off the chart, you're just one step over. So we could go more specific. Okay, so we have birds, and then more specific, that would be like types of birds. And then you get into very specific things related to birds. Feathers, talons, nests. Probably more specific than this, I just don't have enough bird knowledge to really embellish this right now. Or we could go farther the other way. So what else would be related to a bird? Like a bat is related to a bird, but it's, getting farther from bird. The air, birds, flying, okay, flying plane. Now we're into planes, maybe we're gonna get into like planets and stuff. We've moved away from birds, but we haven't just gone anywhere off the map. I think this is a really good technique for a short story when you're really trying to keep cohesion in the language. This isn't probably going to affect the entire diction of an entire novel because it's hard to say that contained within a novel. It's just a good technique for pattern to keep in mind. And in general, you want to keep things tailored to your character's personality. Say you have this really great simile you want to use and it's like about a flower, but then you realize your protagonist is like this really rugged, badass assassin maybe who probably couldn't name a type of flower to save his life. Maybe you want to save that one and use something more appropriate to what the character would actually be thinking. So the other type of pattern you can use is a linguistic pattern, and this is the how you say it. This could include things like slang use, humor, what kind and how much, sarcasm, formality, or the level and type of poetic devices you use. Similarly, this is also going to be found in sentence structure and how the sentences are punctuated. Maybe you have a lot of short sentences, maybe you sometimes use fragments, don't overuse them. Maybe your character uses a lot of parentheses. Maybe your character often slips into second person and speaks directly to the audience. These are going to be linguistic patterns that we can see throughout. Another thing that affects voice is tone. So tone is the story's view towards itself. We have the story, we have objectively what is happening, then we have the tone that's cast over it by the narrator. Now, if you have a really distant narrator, this could be different from how the characters are feeling. Say you have really serious characters, but you actually have a humorous tone because the narrator is kind of laughing at the seriousness of the characters. But if it's in first person, then it's going to be the narrator's attitude towards their own story. How do they feel about their own story? And this can also reflect in the narrator's feeling towards the reader. Now, this gets into the framing of the story, which can also really affect the voice, and I think is a really important thing to consider. The framing story is basically the logical setup of your point of view. How is the story being told? From what point? What is the direction of the story? The first question here is, who is telling the story? Is it a character in the story? Is it a narrator? How close is the narrator to the character? When and where is the story being told from? If you are writing a past tense story in first person, where is your character at the point they're telling the story? Are they 20 years down the line? 5 minutes after the end? How much time has elapsed since the end of the story and the telling of the story? And then similarly to that, why are they telling the story? Why has the character decided to tell this story at this point in time? If my character is telling the story from a point 30 years after the end of the story, why are they telling it now? Why not tell it 10 years ago? Why not tell it right after it happened? Does your character know they have an audience? Who do they think the audience is? How do they feel about the audience? How is the story being told? Is it just being thought, so the character's just thinking the story to themselves as it's happening or rethinking it later? Is the story being spoken verbally? To who? Being written down? If so, in a private diary or in a letter to someone else? Another thing to consider, and this goes a little back to the idea of linguistic patterning, is your character's habits. A really good way to get a sense of habits is to pay attention to people's actual speaking habits. Again, this is quite relevant, especially for first person, but you can also incorporate it into a third person narrative if it's a really close third person. I know, for example, I go on a lot of tangents. I know kind of what my speaking habits are, and I know my friends' speaking habits. Sometimes you can incorporate speaking type habits, maybe not exactly, maybe, you know, a little cleaner into your narrative. So the final thing to consider is your character's reliability. Now, I do want to mention, if you are writing in first person, your character is inherently unreliable. All first-person narrators are unreliable. Close third-person narrators also probably unreliable. The more distant you get, the more reliable you get. Characters all have biases. The closer your point of view, the more subjective it is. Even if your character is a good-natured, trustworthy person, they still have biases, probably somewhat geared towards themselves, and that will affect their storytelling. But it's good to consider how reliable your character is and in what ways. What are they withholding? What are they honest about? And how do they feel about the fact they're telling their story? Are they telling the story because they need to get it off their chest? Because they want to confide in you, the reader, because they just want to retell it to themselves? This will also be affected by the framing. If the character knows they have an audience, they will probably tell their story in a different way than if they don't think they have an audience. If they think they don't have an audience, it's going to be very unfiltered. However, if they are telling to an audience, if they're aware of their audience, there's a sense of confession. So reliability isn't just determined by who the character is as a person, but to a great extent how the story is framed. And as a result, it can really, really affect voice, because it's going to affect their tone, what they choose to tell, how they choose to tell it. So that's everything I wanted to say on voice. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!